In the early months of 1942, the world stood transfixed as the Empire of Japan, fresh from its triumphs across the Pacific, seemed unstoppable. From the smoking ruins of Pearl Harbor to the jungles of Malaya and the Philippines, Japanese forces had spread their banners across an empire that stretched thousands of miles. The rising sun appeared destined to dominate Asia and the Pacific. Tokyo was jubilant. Newspapers proclaimed that the Western powers had been driven to their knees, and the Japanese people were told their divine empire would soon reign supreme. But in Washington, D.C., anger simmered beneath the shock of December 7th. President Franklin D. Roosevelt demanded an answer, something that would strike back at Japan, however symbolically. America needed a blow to its enemy's heart, a strike that would remind friend and foe alike that the United States was far from beaten. The challenge was formidable. Japan's home islands lay far beyond the range of any American bomber. The nearest bases were thousands of miles away, across oceans dominated by the Imperial Navy. Yet a bold idea began to take shape within the mind of one-man Lieutenant Colonel James Harold Doolittle, a fearless pioneer of aviation known for his daring spirit and technical genius. The concept was simple in theory, impossible in practice. Launch medium bombers from an aircraft carrier. No one had ever attempted such a feat before. The U.S. Navy's carriers typically launched small, lightweight fighters and dive bombers, not twin-engine land-based aircraft like the North American B-25 Mitchell. The plan seemed suicidal. The B-25s were too large, their wingspans too wide, their takeoff distance too long. Yet Doolittle, confident and relentless, believed it could be done. Throughout February and March of 1942, secrecy cloaked the preparations. At Eglin Field in Florida, volunteer crews began intensive training. They practiced short takeoffs on runways marked with white lines simulating the narrow deck of an aircraft carrier. The men were told little only that their mission would be dangerous and that they might not return. Each pilot knew that failure meant death or capture, but not one refused the assignment. At the same time, the U.S. Navy made unprecedented modifications. The aircraft carrier USS Hornet, still fresh from the factory, was selected to carry the bombers. Its deck, barely long enough for the task, would serve as the springboard for history. 16 B-25s were craned aboard in Alameda, California, in early April 1942. Sailors and airmen worked side by side, lashing down the planes, stowing fuel, and preparing for the unknown. The Hornet's crew was astonished. Never before had such large aircraft been seen on a carrier deck. The mission remained top secret. Even the men on the Hornet were told only that they were delivering Army planes somewhere in the Pacific. Not until they were far at sea did the truth emerge. On April 18, 1942, they would bomb the Japanese capital Tokyo itself. On April 2nd, the Hornet steamed out of San Francisco Bay, accompanied by her escorts. The carrier task force cut through the Pacific, meeting up with Admiral William Bull Halsey's Task Force 16, centered around the USS Enterprise. Halsey's ships would provide fighter cover and protection on the approach. For the sailors and airmen aboard, the mood was tense but electric. Every man knew they were embarking on one of the most audacious missions of the war. For days, they plowed westward through rough seas and cold winds. The B-25 crews checked and rechecked their planes. Each bomber carried extra fuel tanks, stripped-down armament, and a small load of incendiary and high-explosive bombs. They would have just enough range to reach Japan, strike their targets, and then continue westward to land in friendly Chinese territory, or so they hoped. But fate would intervene. At dawn on April 18th, while still hundreds of miles from their planned launch point, the American task force was spotted by a Japanese picket boat. Though the vessel was quickly sunk by gunfire, it managed to radio a warning to the mainland. Admiral Halsey had no choice. If they delayed, the enemy would be ready. The order was given. Launch immediately. It was a desperate gamble. The bombers would have to fly more than 800 miles to reach Japan, far beyond the safe range for their fuel reserves. Yet not one man hesitated. On the Hornet's windswept deck, the first bomber-in-line Doolittle's own aircraft lurched forward into the gale. The ship pitched in heavy seas, spray washing over the bow. With the throttle wide open, the B-25 rolled down the deck, lifted its nose at the last possible second, and clawed into the air. One by one, the remaining 15 bombers followed, each taking off with only a few feet to spare. The sailors cheered as the last aircraft disappeared into the mist, their engines fading into the grey horizon. For the first time in history, American bombers were on their way to strike the Japanese homeland. Hours later, as the morning clouds parted over Tokyo, air raid sirens wailed. Civilians rushed for cover. Anti-aircraft guns barked across the city, their black puffs bursting against the pale sky. The American planes swooped low, releasing their bombs over military targets, factories, docks, oil tanks, and even the Imperial Palace District. Fires erupted across the capital. For the Japanese people, it was a shock beyond belief. They had been told their islands were invulnerable, protected by divine favor and distance. Now, American bombs were falling on Tokyo itself. The physical damage was limited only a handful of casualties and fires, but the psychological impact was immense. Japanese military leaders were humiliated. The emperor's advisors were furious that foreign aircraft had violated their skies. The Navy and Army traded accusations, each blaming the other for failing to protect the homeland. For the Americans, the raid was a triumph of courage and ingenuity. The news electrified the nation. Newspapers across the United States hailed the Tokyo Raid, celebrating Doolittle and his men as heroes. Roosevelt himself announced the success with deliberate vagueness, saying the bombers had come from Shangri-La, a mythical place from a popular novel. Yet for the men who carried out the raid, the ordeal was far from over. Low on fuel, the B-25s pressed on toward China through darkness and storm. One by one, their engines sputtered dry. Some crews bailed out over rugged terrain. Others crash-landed in rice fields or along the coast. A few were captured by Japanese forces in occupied China. Doolittle himself parachuted into a field and was rescued by friendly villagers. Of the 80 men who took part, 73 survived. 8 were captured, and 3 were executed by the Japanese. The survivors endured months of hardship, but their mission had achieved something far greater than military destruction. It had struck directly at Japan's sense of security and pride. Back in Tokyo, the raid sparked panic and outrage. The Japanese High Command convened emergency meetings. How could such an attack have happened? The Imperial Navy, previously considered the shield of the homeland, had failed. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor, was mortified. His fleet had humiliated the Americans at the start of the war, but now America had returned the insult. Yamamoto understood what the raid meant. Though militarily minor, it exposed Japan's vulnerability and shattered the illusion of invincibility. He realized that as long as the United States possessed carriers capable of striking Japan, the war could not be won through defense alone. Japan would need to annihilate the American fleet completely, to lure it into battle and destroy it once and for all. That idea would soon take shape in a name destined for legend: Midway. In the weeks following the Doolittle Raid, Japan's leadership wrestled with humiliation and fury. The attack had caught them off guard, not because of its scale, but because of what it symbolized. For months, the Japanese press had proclaimed that the war was going entirely according to plan. The Imperial Navy had swept across the Pacific, the army had seized vast territories in Asia, and the emperor's subjects had been told that Japan's homeland was untouchable. Yet now, smoldering buildings in Tokyo and Yokohama told a different story. The realization that American aircraft could reach Japan struck at the very foundation of national pride. Newspapers were censored to downplay the raid's extent, but rumors spread among civilians of American bombers flying over the Imperial Palace itself. Fear crept into a society that had been promised divine protection. In government circles, confidence gave way to paranoia. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto took the failure personally. As commander-in-chief of the combined fleet, he had planned and executed the attack on Pearl Harbor with surgical precision. Now, the Americans had humiliated him in return. To Yamamoto, the Doolittle Raid was not merely an embarrassment, it was a challenge. It told him that unless Japan destroyed the U.S. Navy's aircraft carriers, the empire would forever live under the shadow of another surprise attack. He resolved to strike a blow so decisive that the United States would never recover. His plan was grand and daring, a mirror image of the very audacity that Doolittle had displayed. He would lure the American fleet into a trap and annihilate it in one massive battle. The target he chose was a small, remote atoll in the Central Pacific, Midway. Midway was strategically located roughly halfway between Asia and North America. To the Japanese, it was the perfect bait and isolated outpost that the Americans would surely rush to defend. If the U.S. carriers came, Yamamoto's powerful fleet, with its overwhelming number of ships and aircraft, would crush them. The destruction of America's carrier force, he believed, would force Washington to negotiate peace. In late April, planning began. Even as Japanese forces continued their campaigns in Burma, New Guinea, and the Philippines, Yamamoto concentrated his best ships for the coming operation. The carriers Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. The same strike force that had attacked Pearl Harbor would form the heart of his fleet. Dozens of cruisers, destroyers, and battleships would support them. To the Japanese admirals, it seemed an unbeatable armada. But Yamamoto was not the only one analyzing the implications of the Doolittle Raid. Across the Pacific, in Pearl Harbor, American intelligence officers were listening. For months, U.S. Navy cryptanalysts had been breaking Japanese codes. Working in secrecy at Station Hypo, under the direction of Commander Joseph Rochefort, they intercepted and deciphered enemy communications. Piece by piece, they began to assemble a picture of Japan's next move. By late May, Rochefort's team had cracked enough of the Japanese naval code to identify AF as the target of an impending operation. Some officers doubted it meant Midway, but the intelligence team devised a clever ruse. They ordered the base at Midway to send an unencrypted radio message reporting a water shortage. Within hours, Japanese intelligence transmitted that AF is short of water. The trick worked. The Americans knew for certain that Midway was the target. Armed with this knowledge, Admiral Chester W. Nimitz prepared an ambush of his own. Despite being outnumbered, he planned to turn the tables on Yamamoto. He gathered the carriers Enterprise, Hornet, and the hastily repaired Yorktown. With these three, he would face Japan's four. The stage was set for one of the most consequential battles in naval history. Meanwhile, in China, the aftermath of the Doolittle Raid turned tragic. Furious at the Chinese for aiding downed American airmen, Japanese forces launched a brutal campaign of retribution. Entire villages were burned, and thousands of civilians were killed in what became known as the Zhejiang-Jiangxi campaign. Doolittle and his men, sheltered by Chinese peasants and guerrillas, learned of the devastation with heavy hearts. Their raid had exacted a terrible price on innocent lives. In the United States, however, the mood was one of jubilation. The Doolittle Raiders returned home to a hero's welcome. Their success provided a desperately needed morale boost at a time when Allied forces were retreating on every front. President Roosevelt awarded Doolittle the Medal of Honor, promoting him to Brigadier General. Newspapers declared the raid proof that Japan could and would be struck again. Behind the celebrations, however, American strategists grasped the deeper consequences of their victory. They understood that the raid had forced Japan's hand. Yamamoto's pride, wounded by the humiliation of April, was driving him toward a confrontation he could ill afford. His plan to attack Midway, conceived in anger, would stretch Japan's naval power to its limits. As May turned to June 1942, fleets on both sides prepared for the decisive clash. On the Japanese flagship Yamato, Yamamoto's officers pored over maps, confident of success. Their code of Bushido taught them that courage and divine destiny favored their empire. They believed the Americans were demoralized, their fleet still crippled by Pearl Harbor. The Doolittle Raid, they assumed, had been a one-time stunt bold, but meaningless. They were wrong. On June 4, 1942, the Battle of Midway began. As the sun rose over the Pacific, Japanese carrier planes struck the island, bombarding its airfields. But even as they attacked, American scout planes had already located the Japanese fleet. Squadrons of U.S. torpedo bombers, flying low and slow, launched desperate assaults on the Japanese carriers. One by one, they were shot down, entire squadrons wiped out. Yet their sacrifice drew the Japanese fighters away from altitude. Moments later, from high above the clouds, American dive bombers appeared. In a few devastating minutes, they changed the course of the war. The carriers Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu were hit by precision strikes. Flames erupted, turning decks into infernos. Hours later, the fourth carrier, Hiryu, met the same fate. By nightfall, 4 of Japan's finest carriers veterans of Pearl Harbor were sinking beneath the waves. The victory at Midway was total. Japan had lost over 300 aircraft, thousands of sailors, and the heart of its naval aviation force. The Imperial Navy would never again recover its former strength. For Yamamoto, it was the bitter realization of his own prophecy. After Pearl Harbor, he had warned his superiors that Japan could run wild for 6 months, but beyond that, he could promise nothing. Midway came almost exactly 6 months later. The Doolittle Raid had set this chain of events in motion. Its bombs had done little physical harm to Japan, but they had struck at its soul. The attack had provoked a decision born of pride, and that pride had led to catastrophe. For America, Midway marked the turning point. From that moment, the initiative in the Pacific passed to the United States. The myth of Japanese invincibility was shattered forever. And behind it all, the echoes of Doolittle's daring flight still lingered, the sound of engines roaring off the deck of the USS Hornet, the defiant gesture of a nation refusing to surrender. In later years, historians would debate the true impact of the raid. Some argued it was a mere morale operation. Others insisted it shaped the strategic course of the Pacific War. But for those who lived it, for the sailors who watched the B-25s vanish into the mist, for the civilians who saw flames rising over Tokyo, for the men who fought and died at Midway, it was no abstraction. It was the moment when the tide began to turn. Yamamoto's obsession with avenging the Doolittle Raid did not end at Midway. Even after his fleet's devastating loss, he remained determined to regain Japan's honor. For months, he directed operations across the South Pacific, personally visiting forward bases to inspire his men. But fate had another reckoning in store. In April 1943, exactly 1 year after the Doolittle Raid, American codebreakers intercepted a Japanese transmission, revealing that Yamamoto would be flying from Rabaul to Bougainville. Acting on this intelligence, U.S. fighters ambushed his transport plane. It was shot down over the jungle. The admiral who had once commanded Japan's mightiest fleet perished in flames, brought down by the same intelligence network that had once foreseen his trap at Midway. His death symbolized the reversal of fortune that had begun with Doolittle's strike. What started as a daring gamble by 16 bombers had grown into a chain reaction that reshaped the Pacific War. The psychological wound inflicted on Japan in April 1942 would never fully heal. The Doolittle Raid was more than a military operation. It was a statement. It said that the United States, despite suffering one of the greatest blows in its history at Pearl Harbor, would never accept defeat. It told the world that America could reach across oceans and strike at the very heart of its enemies. And it proved to its own people that courage and ingenuity could overcome even the most impossible odds. In the months following the raid, and the subsequent victory at Midway, the balance of the Pacific War began to shift. Japan, once an unstoppable juggernaut, found itself forced onto the defensive. Its vast conquests now stretched supply lines thin. The Imperial Navy, deprived of its elite carrier aviators and much of its striking power, could no longer project dominance with the same confidence. For the United States, Midway became a rallying point, a moment that transformed despair into determination. Factories across the country roared to life, producing ships, aircraft, and munitions at a pace the world had never seen. The B-25 bombers that had launched from the USS Hornet became a symbol of American resolve, their image printed on posters and recruiting pamphlets. The names of the Doolittle Raiders were celebrated in newspapers, radio broadcasts, and hometown parades. But even as the nation celebrated, the men themselves remained humble. Many of them felt that their success was measured not by destruction, but by the courage they had shown. James Doolittle himself believed that the mission had been a failure at first. When he parachuted into China, he assumed that all his men and aircraft had been lost, and that he would face a court-martial. Instead, he returned home to find himself a national hero. His leadership, daring, and technical mastery became the stuff of legend. The raid also exposed a moral complexity that lingered in the background of wartime glory. The Japanese reprisals against Chinese civilians, brutal and uncompromising, were a grim reminder that even acts of heroism carried unintended consequences. Tens of thousands of innocent people suffered for the assistance they gave to the downed American crews. It was a tragedy that Doolittle and his men never forgot. Many of them would later dedicate efforts to aid the people of China, acknowledging the heavy price that had been paid. In Japan, the psychological scars ran deep. The raid had punctured the myth of invulnerability that the military government had so carefully cultivated. For centuries, Japan's isolation and geographic distance had shielded it from foreign attack. Now, the modern age had erased that barrier. Air power had turned the Pacific into a highway of destruction. Japanese propaganda tried to downplay the raid, calling it an insignificant nuisance, but internally, the blow to national confidence was devastating. The Imperial Army demanded stricter homeland defense measures. Anti-aircraft batteries were rushed to key cities, and radar installations began to appear along the coasts. The Navy increased patrols and invested heavily in expanding its air reconnaissance. These were desperate measures meant to reassure a shaken population. The Doolittle Raid had also revealed a crucial truth to the Japanese High Command. The United States possessed an industrial potential that could not be ignored. The Japanese knew that the 16 bombers launched from a single carrier represented only a fraction of America's growing military capability. They understood that behind that symbolic attack lay a vast and awakening giant. For Yamamoto, the realization was bitter. He had studied in America. He understood its people and its power. Before the war, he had warned his government that Japan could not hope to win a prolonged conflict against such an opponent. He famously predicted that for 6 months he could run wild, but beyond that, the tide would inevitably turn. The Doolittle Raid and the ensuing events at Midway proved him right in a way he had never wished to be. As 1942 gave way to 1943, the Pacific Theater became a war of attrition. The United States began its island-hopping campaign, striking at Japanese positions across the Solomon Islands, New Guinea, and the Central Pacific. Each victory brought American bombers closer to Japan itself. What had once seemed impossible, the ability to attack the Japanese homeland regularly, was becoming a matter of time and logistics. The lessons learned from Doolittle's raid echoed throughout these campaigns. Pilots studied the daring navigation and low-altitude flying techniques used by the B-25 crews. Naval planners examined the coordination between the Army Air Forces and the Navy that had made the operation possible. The raid became a model for joint force cooperation, foreshadowing the massive amphibious assaults that would later define the Pacific War. Even within Japan, a quiet admiration existed among some officers for the audacity of the Americans. They respected the courage it took to fly heavy bombers from a carrier deck, knowing that return was almost impossible. The Bushido Code prized bravery above all else, and in a paradoxical way, the Doolittle Raiders had demonstrated the very spirit that Japanese warriors revered. For the American public, the story became legend. It represented not only vengeance for Pearl Harbor, but also the triumph of ingenuity over arrogance. It reassured the people that technology and courage could overcome distance and fear. The image of those bombers lifting off into the gray Pacific became an icon of resistance. It told every factory worker, every soldier in training, every mother sending her son overseas that the fight was far from lost. By 1944, the United States had achieved overwhelming superiority. New carriers like the Essex-class ships dwarfed the Hornet, and advanced aircraft such as the B-29 Superfortress were capable of reaching Japan directly from distant island bases. The dream of striking Tokyo, once considered nearly impossible, became a daily reality. American air raids leveled city after city, culminating in the firebombing of Tokyo in March 1945. A horrific inferno that killed tens of thousands. In those final years, as Japan's cities burned and its navy lay shattered, many within the Japanese military looked back to the Doolittle Raid as the beginning of the end. That single strike had changed their perception of the enemy. It revealed the length to which the Americans would go and the persistence with which they would fight. What had seemed a fleeting act of defiance in 1942 had become, in retrospect, the spark that ignited an unstoppable chain of events. When peace finally came in August 1945, the surviving Doolittle Raiders returned to civilian life. They were scattered across the nation, living quiet lives away from the spotlight. Yet each year, they gathered for reunions, sharing memories of their shared ordeal. They toasted their fallen comrades with silver goblets, each engraved with their names. As the years passed, the number of toasts grew fewer, but the bond between them remained unbroken. For James Doolittle, the raid was both a personal and historical milestone. Though he would go on to serve with distinction throughout the war and achieve the rank of lieutenant general, he always regarded the Tokyo mission as the defining moment of his career. In later interviews, he spoke with humility, crediting his men and the Navy for the success. He never glorified the destruction or the fame that followed. He spoke instead of courage, cooperation, and sacrifice. History would come to see the Doolittle Raid as a turning point, not for the physical damage it caused, but for the shift it created in hearts and minds. It proved that morale, faith, and willpower were as vital to victory as guns and ships. It showed that even in the darkest hour, boldness could rekindle hope. The raid's legacy endured through generations. In films, documentaries, and textbooks, it stood as a symbol of American resilience. Schoolchildren learned of the men who took off from a carrier deck, knowing they might never return. Their courage became part of the nation's mythology, woven into the larger story of how freedom triumphed over tyranny. In Japan, too, the story found its place not as a tale of shame, but as a lesson in humility. In the decades that followed, both nations would grow into allies, bound by shared respect and mutual understanding. The war that had begun with fire and fury ended with reconciliation, and the Doolittle Raid remained one of the earliest sparks in that long, painful journey. The sound of those 16 B-25 engines still echoes through history. It is the sound of defiance, of daring, of a nation rising from its knees. It reminds us that even the smallest strike, born of courage and necessity, can alter the course of destiny. By the late 1940s, the Doolittle Raid had already passed from a wartime event into legend. The men who had carried it out were no longer just soldiers. They had become symbols of defiance. Hollywood soon seized upon their story. In 1944, even before the war ended, MGM released 30 Seconds Over Tokyo, a film based on the memoir of one of the raiders, Ted Lawson. It captured the imagination of a public still reeling from years of war. The movie depicted the daring flight, the crash landings in China, and the heroism of ordinary men facing impossible odds. Audiences wept, cheered, and left theaters believing again in the power of courage. But for the raiders themselves, the real story was far more complex. Many of them carried the weight of the war long after the parades ended. They had seen friends die, endured captivity, and lived with memories of destruction that haunted their dreams. Some struggled with survivor's guilt, wondering why they had lived while others had perished. For Doolittle, fame brought honor, but also a quiet burden, the knowledge that his victory had come at a terrible cost. Japan, too, was forced to confront the deeper meaning of the raid in the aftermath of the war. As American occupation authorities rebuilt the nation, Japanese scholars and writers began to re-examine the myths that had sustained their wartime ideology. The Doolittle Raid, once depicted as an insignificant nuisance, was now understood as the first sign that Japan's war strategy had been flawed from the beginning. It had revealed the dangers of overconfidence, the peril of underestimating one's enemy. Historians on both sides of the Pacific came to recognize that the raid had achieved its most important victories not in material destruction, but in the realm of perception. In military terms, the bombs dropped on Tokyo had been a pinprick. But psychologically, they had struck deep. They had shattered Japan's aura of invincibility and proven that America's reach was longer than anyone had imagined. That psychological shock reshaped the course of the conflict. It forced Japan to overextend itself, pushing into the fatal gamble of Midway. It forced the United States to believe in its own capacity to fight back. And it showed the world that even in the bleakest hour, a single daring act could shift the balance of morale and destiny. In the years that followed, the Doolittle Raid became a study in leadership and innovation. Military academies dissected the operation as an example of inter-service cooperation, an Army mission launched from a Navy platform, made possible only through unity and creative problem-solving. It was proof that when faced with impossible challenges, adaptability could turn the improbable into the achievable. James Doolittle himself embodied that spirit of innovation. Before the war, he had been an experimental pilot, a scientist of the air. He earned a doctorate in aeronautical engineering from MIT, making him one of the most technically skilled officers in the Army Air Corps. He was the first to perform an outside loop, the first to fly blind using only instruments, and the first to link aviation with modern science. When the war came, those same qualities, courage, precision, and intellect, made him the ideal man for an impossible mission. When Doolittle led his men off the deck of the Hornet, he wasn't just launching planes, he was launching an idea that innovation, when coupled with determination, could rewrite the rules of war. The success of the raid vindicated that belief. It also paved the way for new tactics that would dominate the skies in the years to come. As the world entered the Cold War era, the legacy of Doolittle's mission lived on in the strategies of deterrence and long-range strike capability. The concept of projecting power across continents became central to American defense doctrine. Strategic bombers, nuclear-armed and capable of striking anywhere on Earth, were the direct descendants of those 16 B-25s. The spirit of Shangri-La. Roosevelt's playful name for the raid's mysterious origin found new meaning in the idea of global reach. For Japan, the memory of that April morning remained etched into its collective consciousness. The generation that had lived through the raid remembered the fear, the confusion, and the realization that war had come home. In the post-war years, as Japan rebuilt itself into a peaceful, industrial democracy, that memory became a lesson in humility. Never again, many believed, should their nation provoke such devastation. By the 1950s and 1960s, Japan's relationship with the United States had transformed completely. Former enemies became allies, bound together by trade, security, and shared democratic ideals. The men who had once fought each other across the Pacific now met as veterans, shaking hands and sharing stories. Among them were the Doolittle Raiders, who visited Japan decades later, not as conquerors, but as honored guests. The reception they received was warm and respectful, an acknowledgement that courage, on either side, deserved recognition. As the decades passed, the number of surviving raiders dwindled, yet their annual reunions continued, a ritual of remembrance and brotherhood. Each year, they gathered around a set of 80 silver goblets, each engraved with a name. When a raider died, his goblet was turned upside down, resting in silence beside his comrades. The tradition became a powerful symbol of loyalty and sacrifice. In 2013, the surviving Doolittle Raiders held their final public toast. Only 4 men remained. They met at the National Museum of the United States Air Force in Dayton, Ohio, surrounded by the very B-25s that had carried them into legend. As they raised their glasses, the crowd fell silent. The men spoke of courage, of loss, and of the bonds that war had forged between them. Then they drank to those who were gone, to the 80 who had changed history with one act of audacity. That final toast marked the end of an era, but the spirit of the Doolittle Raid lives on. It endures not only in history books, but in the hearts of those who believe that courage can defy circumstance. The raid stands as a reminder that wars are not won solely by numbers or machines, but by willpower and imagination. It also stands as a warning. The psychological warfare that the Doolittle Raid unleashed a battle for morale, perception, and pride has echoed through conflicts ever since. In every war that followed, leaders sought to recreate that same shock value, that same sudden strike that could turn the tide of morale. From Korea to Vietnam to modern conflicts, the lesson remained. Sometimes the greatest victories are won not by destruction, but by inspiration. For the Japanese people, the raid marked the first step toward a painful awakening. It showed them that their empire's expansion could not last forever, that the world they sought to dominate was larger and more resilient than they imagined. It forced a reckoning that would, decades later, transform Japan into a nation of peace rather than conquest. For the Americans, the raid symbolized the opposite, the rebirth of confidence. It proved that the country could strike back, could adapt, could overcome. In the smoke and fire of Tokyo, the United States found the will to fight until victory. That spirit carried the nation through the blood-soaked years of Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. In that sense, the Doolittle Raid was both a beginning and a prophecy. It foreshadowed the end of Japanese expansion and the rise of American power in the Pacific. It showed how one act, small in scale but vast in meaning, could alter the trajectory of a global war. In his later years, James Doolittle was often asked what he thought of the raid's legacy. His answer was always humble. "We didn't do it for glory," he once said. "We did it because it needed to be done." Those words, simple and sincere, captured the essence of his generation. A generation that faced the impossible and triumphed not through arrogance, but through duty. The bombers that roared off the USS Hornet in April 1942 are long gone, their metal frames claimed by time and the sea. But their story endures, not as a tale of destruction, but as a beacon of resolve. It reminds every listener, every student of history, that courage can turn despair into victory, that leadership can inspire the impossible, and that even in the darkest moment of war, a spark of defiance can light the way to freedom. As the 20th century unfolded, the Doolittle Raid took on a new resonance. It became not just a story of wartime heroism, but a parable about the power of imagination in the face of fear. In classrooms, lecture halls, and military academies, students studied it not simply as a daring mission, but as an exercise in leadership under uncertainty. It was a testament to how vision and courage could transform desperation into opportunity. The operation itself had been born from desperation. In the dark winter of 1942, the United States was reeling. Pearl Harbor had left the Pacific Fleet crippled, the Philippines were falling, and morale at home was dangerously low. American citizens followed grim headlines of defeat in Asia, and in Europe, the Nazi war machine continued its advance. Roosevelt understood that the nation needed a spark something that would remind its people that the tide could and would turn. That spark came from Doolittle and his men. When the news broke of the raid's success, the psychological shift was immediate. Across America, newspapers printed bold headlines: U.S. bombers, strike Tokyo. Citizens poured into the streets, waving flags and cheering. It was the first good news of the war, the first sign that the United States could hit back. For the first time since December 7, 1941, Americans felt hope. The Japanese leadership, however, felt only fury. The raid exposed not just a military weakness, but a political one. The militarist factions that dominated Tokyo had built their authority on the myth of Japan's divine protection. Now, that illusion was shattered. Ordinary citizens began to question whether their leaders could truly protect them. The Army and Navy turned on each other, each seeking to assign blame. That internal division would haunt Japan throughout the rest of the war. From a strategic standpoint, the Doolittle Raid forced Japan into a posture of reaction rather than initiative. The entire purpose of Yamamoto's Midway plan was to restore control over the narrative, to reassert dominance, and erase the embarrassment of April 1942. But in doing so, Japan walked directly into an American trap. Thus, the raid's psychological impact rippled forward into one of the most decisive battles of the 20th century. In later analyses, historians often describe this sequence of events as the chain of unintended consequences. A mission designed primarily for morale had set off a cascade that would alter the balance of global power. Without the Doolittle Raid, Yamamoto might never have rushed into the Battle of Midway. Without Midway, the United States might not have gained the strategic momentum it needed to take the offensive in the Pacific. And without that momentum, the war might have dragged on far longer, with far greater loss. Yet beyond strategy and geopolitics, the raid's legacy lay in the human stories it produced. The quiet bravery, the acts of compassion, the endurance of those who risked everything. When the 16 bombers left the USS Hornet, each carried not only bombs, but faith. Faith in one another, in their leaders, and in the cause they fought for. Many of the men who parachuted into China were aided by villagers who risked their lives to hide them from Japanese patrols. Those villagers paid dearly when the Japanese retaliated, yet they never betrayed the Americans. It was a bond of shared humanity that transcended nationality and war. In the years after the conflict, Doolittle often spoke of his gratitude to the Chinese people. He knew that without them, few, if any, of his men would have survived. In 1946, he personally lobbied Congress to send humanitarian aid to China as a gesture of thanks. His advocacy reflected the kind of leader he was not driven by ego, but by conscience. Doolittle's post-war career mirrored his restless intellect. He served in various command roles, eventually overseeing the 8th Air Force in Europe, and later the 12th and 15th in North Africa and Italy. After the war, he entered the corporate world, working for Shell Oil and serving as a civilian advisor to the U.S. government. Yet wherever he went, he was still the man who bombed Tokyo. To the men who served under him, Doolittle remained more than a commander. He was a symbol of faith under fire. His calm, analytical demeanor during the planning of the raid had inspired confidence even when the odds seemed impossible. He treated his men as equals, listening to their ideas, valuing their expertise. In return, they would have followed him anywhere. That bond of trust, forged in secrecy and uncertainty, became the foundation of their success. The Doolittle Raiders themselves scattered across post-war America. Some continued in military service, rising through the ranks of the newly formed U.S. Air Force. Others returned to civilian life, becoming teachers, engineers, and businessmen. A few, like navigator Jake DeShazer, found religion in captivity and later returned to Japan as a missionary, preaching forgiveness to the very people who had once held him prisoner. His story, along with that of Mitsuo Fuchida, the Japanese pilot who led the Pearl Harbor attack and later converted to Christianity, after meeting DeShazer, became a powerful example of reconciliation. It was a reminder that the human spirit can transcend even the deepest wounds of war. The Doolittle Raid also became a study in innovation under constraint. Every part of the mission, from modifying the bombers for short takeoff to planning fuel reserves to coordinating Navy and Army logistics, was a masterclass in adaptive thinking. Military planners in later decades studied it as an example of mission command, a doctrine emphasizing initiative and autonomy within broad objectives. Doolittle had trusted his men to make their own decisions once airborne, understanding that flexibility was their greatest weapon. That lesson became especially relevant in the modern era, as technology advanced and warfare evolved. The raid's principles, speed, surprise, and adaptability, remain cornerstones of modern military strategy. In many ways, it anticipated the tactics of stealth operations, precision strikes, and joint force missions that define 21st century warfare. But perhaps the most enduring legacy of the Doolittle Raid lies in its emotional power. Even decades later, it continues to evoke a sense of awe. When visitors stand before a restored B-25 in a museum, or watch the grainy black and white footage of the planes lifting off from the Hornet, they feel the same tension that gripped the sailors that morning in April 1942. The pounding surf, the pitching deck, the deafening roar of engines fighting gravity. It is a visceral reminder that courage often begins in fear. Every detail of that morning has been preserved in accounts and diaries. The wind whipping across the deck, the smell of salt and fuel, the sight of sailors cheering as each bomber cleared the bow by mere feet. Many of those who witnessed it later said they knew, in that moment, that they were seeing history unfold. The combination of resolve and uncertainty gave the scene a cinematic quality, though none of the participants felt like heroes. They were men doing a job, following orders, and trusting in one another. Today, historians recognize the Doolittle Raid as one of the most consequential minor operations in history. Its direct damage was limited, but its ripple effects were enormous. It altered enemy psychology, redirected strategic priorities, and redefined what air power could accomplish. It demonstrated that morale was a weapon as potent as any bomb. As the last of the raiders passed away in the 21st century, tributes poured in from around the world. Newspapers called them the men who taught America to fight again. Military leaders praised their audacity, and even Japanese historians acknowledged their impact. In Tokyo, where the fires of 1942 had long since been replaced by neon lights and skyscrapers, the memory of that morning still lingered, a distant echo of engines that had once pierced the quiet sky. Their legacy was not vengeance, but endurance. It was not destruction, but inspiration. The Doolittle Raid proved that victory begins not on the battlefield, but in the heart. It begins when fear is faced and overcome, when people refuse to accept the limits imposed by circumstance. It begins when a handful of volunteers decide that courage is worth any price. That truth transcends time. It applies to every generation, every challenge. And it reminds us that history's greatest moments often come from those who dare to do what others call impossible. In the final accounting of history, the Doolittle Raid endures not merely as a military exploit, but as a moment when the human spirit refused to yield. It was conceived in desperation, executed in secrecy, and remembered with reverence. Its story is not only about warplanes and explosions, but about conviction, the kind that burns even when the odds are overwhelming. April 18, 1942, remains one of those rare moments when symbolism outweighs scale. 16 bombers, a few tons of explosives, and 80 men shifted the emotional landscape of a world at war. They restored a sense of balance to a nation still bleeding from Pearl Harbor. They forced a powerful enemy to look inward and realize that its triumphs were not invincible. And they redefined the meaning of courage, proving that audacity itself can be a weapon. Each of the raiders carried that legacy for the rest of their lives. They were not men of boastful words or grand speeches. They were practical, disciplined, and loyal. When asked how they found the nerve to take off from that short deck into the unknown, most simply answered, "We had a job to do." That simplicity is what made their courage so profound. When historians reconstruct the morning of the launch, they often describe a scene charged with quiet determination. The sea was rough. The wind howled across the flight deck. Sailors lined the rails, saluting as each B-25 rolled forward. The ship's bow rose and fell with the swells, and timing the takeoff became an act of instinct. Doolittle was the first to go. His bomber crept forward, engines at full throttle, the propellers slicing the mist. As the deck fell away beneath him, the plane dropped towards the waves, then climbed sharply into the grey horizon. Cheers erupted across the ship. The impossible had begun. For the next hour, 15 more bombers followed, each taking off under conditions that defied reason. There were no catapults, no second chances. A single miscalculation meant disaster. But every pilot made it airborne. The sight of those heavy planes climbing out of the ocean spray, vanishing into the east, left an impression no one aboard the Hornet ever forgot. That moment, men and machines rising from a heaving deck toward destiny, has come to embody the essence of American resolve during World War II. It speaks to the ability of ordinary individuals to achieve extraordinary things when united by purpose. In later decades, as technology advanced and wars became more impersonal, the Doolittle Raid remained a human story. It was about risk, teamwork, and the willingness to act when success seemed impossible. It was about the trust between services, the collaboration of the Army Air Forces and the Navy, and the shared conviction that even symbolic victories mattered. Military strategists still study it for its daring logistics and psychological insight. Leadership experts cite it as a model for inspiring teams under extreme pressure. The combination of careful planning and courageous improvisation continues to offer lessons that extend far beyond the battlefield. Yet the most powerful lessons are moral ones. The Doolittle Raid demonstrates that hope itself can be strategic. It shows that morale, though intangible, can alter the course of history. It reminds us that a single decision to act, to resist, to try, can change everything. For Japan, the raid left a complicated legacy. In the years after the war, as the nation rebuilt, the story became both a source of pain and reflection. It forced a confrontation with the arrogance that had driven its wartime policies. In a strange way, the raid also became part of Japan's rebirth. The same qualities of discipline, ingenuity, and resilience that had once fueled its war machine were redirected into peaceful reconstruction. The result was a nation that rose from ashes to become one of the most prosperous societies on Earth. By the late 20th century, Japan and the United States had forged a friendship that would have seemed impossible in 1942. Joint ceremonies, academic exchanges, and cultural tributes honored the memory of both sides' bravery. At some events, Japanese dignitaries stood beside surviving raiders, offering gestures of respect and reconciliation. In those quiet moments, the old enmities dissolved, replaced by a shared understanding of sacrifice. In 1980, on the anniversary of the raid, James Doolittle stood before an audience of veterans and civilians in Tokyo. His voice, still strong though aged, carried the same calm authority that had inspired his men decades earlier. "War," he said, "teaches hard lessons. The greatest of them is that courage and honor must serve peace, or they serve nothing at all." The audience, Japanese and American alike, rose in applause. That speech marked one of his last public appearances in Japan. It encapsulated the transformation of a moment of violence into a bridge of understanding. Doolittle had spent his life chasing the limits of flight, but his greatest achievement was moral altitude, rising above vengeance toward wisdom. As the years passed and the world changed, the story of the raid continued to inspire new generations. In the age of digital warfare and satellites, the image of propeller-driven bombers taking off from a heaving deck might seem distant, almost primitive. Yet the essence remains timeless. Every generation faces its own moment when fear threatens to paralyze action, when the odds seem too great. The Doolittle Raid whispers across the decades. Act anyway. When the last of the Doolittle Raiders passed away in the early 21st century, their story was retold once more. Newspapers across the world published obituaries that read like eulogies for an era. In Dayton, Ohio, at the Air Force Museum, the final goblet was turned upside down. The ceremony was brief but deeply moving. Around the display case stood veterans, historians, and young cadets people, separated by decades but united in respect. A bugler played taps, and silence fell. Inside that silence lay the echo of engines, the sound of courage taking flight. Today, when historians recount the turning points of World War II, they often list Pearl Harbor, Midway, Stalingrad, Normandy. But woven quietly among them is April 18, 1942, the day when 16 bombers changed the world. It was not the largest battle or the deadliest mission, but it was the spark that ignited transformation. Without it, the story of the Pacific War, and perhaps the story of the modern world, would have unfolded very differently. The raid also serves as a reminder of the interconnectedness of history. It shows how a single act of defiance can ripple outward, influencing events, shaping destinies, and redefining nations. The bombs that fell on Tokyo did not decide the war, but they changed the psychology of it. They turned a global conflict into a struggle of will, in which belief mattered as much as firepower. For those who seek meaning in history, the Doolittle Raid offers a simple truth. Greatness often begins with doubt. The men who launched that morning were afraid, uncertain, and outnumbered. Yet they acted, and in acting, they changed the course of a war and the fate of millions. From the deck of the Hornet to the burning skies over Tokyo, from the jungles of China to the halls of history, their story endures as a reminder of what humanity is capable of when guided by courage instead of fear. In the end, the Doolittle Raid was not just an American victory. It was a human one. It revealed the depth of resilience within ordinary people. It proved that defiance can be noble, that sacrifice can inspire, and that from the smallest spark can rise a flame strong enough to light the darkest times. And so, when we remember April 1942, we remember more than bombs and planes. We remember the unbroken spirit of those who dared to believe that the impossible could be done. We remember the moment when America's will to fight was reborn. We remember that courage, in any age, is timeless. That is the legacy of the Doolittle Raid. It began as an act of vengeance. It became a lesson in endurance. And it endures still as proof that even in the vastness of war, a handful of men can alter the course of history with nothing more than faith, skill, and the will to fly into the unknown.